You are looking at a modern naval fleet, and you are confused because the labels no longer match the reality. A 3,000-ton ship is called a corvette, while a ship twice that size is also called a corvette. To understand this chaos, we must strip away the marketing and look at the brutal logic of naval architecture. The story begins in the Age of Sail, where physics, not politics, dictated classification. The ship of the line was the capital asset, a floating fortress designed to withstand maximum kinetic energy. It traded speed for armor and firepower, forming a wall of wood and iron that decided the fate of nations. Below this heavyweight champion was the frigate, the eyes of the fleet. Frigates were built for speed and independence, carrying a single gun deck to keep weight low and agility high. They hunted commerce, relayed signals, and escaped fights they couldn't win. Speed was their only armor. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and the steam engine destroyed this elegant hierarchy. Wind was no longer the limiting factor. You could simply add more coal to make a heavy ship fast. The distinction between a fast frigate and a heavy battleship blurred into a single category, the ironclad. By 1890, the term frigate had effectively vanished, replaced by the cruiser, a ship capable of independent global operations. But technology was about to introduce a lethal asymmetry that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare. The self-propelled torpedo, invented by Robert Whitehead, allowed a cheap wooden boat to sink $1 million battleship. This was an existential threat to the capital ship. The torpedo boat was the ultimate glass cannon. Navies panicked and built a counter-weapon, the torpedo boat destroyer, designed to hunt these assassins. Over time, the name was shortened to destroyer, but the mission profile expanded. Destroyers became the fleet's sheepdogs, screening the high-value assets from submarines, aircraft, and surface threats. By the 1920s, a new force entered the design room: international law. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 was a geopolitical straitjacket that artificially defined ship classes. It wasn't engineers defining ships anymore. It was lawyers drawing arbitrary lines in the water. A cruiser was legally defined as a ship under 10,000 tons with guns no larger than 8 inches. This created the treaty cruiser, a design compromised by artificial weight limits rather than tactical needs. This legal fiction split cruisers into heavy and light classes based solely on gun caliber, not the ship's actual size. A light cruiser could actually be larger than a heavy cruiser, as long as its guns were 6 inches or smaller. Meanwhile, the frigate name remained dead, buried in history books, until the desperation of World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic demanded hundreds of escort ships to protect merchant convoys from German U-boats. Destroyers were too expensive and complex to build in the sheer numbers required for convoy duty. The British dusted off a whaling ship design, slapped a gun on it, and called it a Corvette the Flower class. These corvettes were cheap, miserable to ride, and barely ocean-worthy, but they could carry depth charges. However, the Flower class was too small for the rough mid-Atlantic. The crews were breaking under the strain. The Royal Navy needed a bigger escort, something larger than a corvette but cheaper than a destroyer. They built the River class, and looking for a name, they resurrected the term frigate. This is the moment the timeline fractures. The World War II frigate was slow, defensive, and cheap. It was the exact opposite of the fast, offensive, prestige frigate of the Age of Sail. So the modern definition of a frigate is built on a historical contradiction born of wartime necessity. Post-war, the confusion accelerated as technology miniaturized lethality. Guided missiles replaced big guns, meaning a small ship could now kill a massive target from over the horizon. The correlation between ship size and firepower, which had held true for centuries, was broken. In the Cold War, the Soviet Union exploited this, putting massive anti-ship missiles on small, fast hulls. The US Navy, obsessed with carrier battle groups, struggled to categorize these new threats. They called their own cruiser-sized missile ships frigates, DLG, creating a massive nomenclature gap with NATO allies. A British frigate was a small anti-submarine escort. An American frigate was a 5,000-ton missile cruiser. This linguistic drift became a tactical liability, confusing joint operations and budget hearings alike. In 1975, the US Navy admitted defeat and reclassified its entire fleet to match international standards. Overnight, frigates became cruisers, and destroyer escorts were promoted to frigates. But the physical reality of the ships hadn't changed, only the painted numbers on their hulls. This proves the golden rule of naval classification. A ship is whatever the funding committee says it is. Today, We face a new crisis of definition as corvettes grow into frigates and destroyers rival World War II battleships. The catalyst that blurred the line between frigate and destroyer wasn't a surface ship, it was a submarine. Late in World War II, Germany deployed the Type XXI U-boat, a technological terror capable of 17 knots underwater. Traditional frigates, plodding along at 20 knots, could no longer catch or escape this new predator. Post-war naval doctrine panicked. To hunt the new Soviet submarines, the humble frigate needed a massive engine upgrade. But naval architecture follows a cruel law. To go faster efficiently, you need a longer hull. You cannot simply shove a massive turbine into a short hull. The hydrodynamics will fight you. So, the anti-submarine frigate began to grow, stretching its steel skin to accommodate the speed required for the chase. By the 1960s, frigates had ballooned in size, encroaching on the displacement territory previously reserved for destroyers. Simultaneously, the visual identification of warships became impossible for the untrained eye. In 1940, you counted the gun turrets to judge a ship's power. Big guns meant a big threat. Today, the most lethal weapons are hidden flush with the deck in vertical launch systems, VLS. A massive cruiser and a modest frigate might look nearly identical from a satellite, flat decks betraying nothing. The lethality is now binary. A single cell can hold a Tomahawk cruise missile or a defensive interceptor. This modularity destroyed the visual hierarchy. A 5,000-ton ship could now level a city. This ambiguity allowed politicians to weaponize the terminology for budget approval. We call this the fiscal frigate phenomenon, a linguistic camouflage used to hide military expansion. Calling a ship a destroyer sounds aggressive, expensive, and offensive to the tax-paying public. Calling the same ship a frigate sounds defensive, prudent, and responsible. The British Type 26 City class is officially designated a global combat ship frigate. Yet, at 8,000 tons, it is heavier than the destroyers of the Cold War and packs comparable firepower. Conversely, the German F-125 Baden-Württemberg class is a massive 7,200-ton beast. Germany calls it a frigate to emphasize its stabilization role, despite it dwarfing many neighbors' destroyers. Then you have the Americans, who lean into the destroyer label with the Arleigh Burke class. The latest Flight 3 Burkes displace nearly 10,000 tons, effectively World War II cruiser territory. So we have frigates that act like destroyers, and destroyers that are secretly cruisers. The confusion is not a bug. It is a feature of modern geopolitical signaling. Nations classify ships based on the message they want to send, not the metal they put in the water. If you want to project power, you build a destroyer. If you want to avoid escalation, you send a frigate. But beneath the labels, the mission profiles have merged into a general-purpose soup. Most modern surface combatants are expected to do everything: hunt subs, shoot down jets, and strike land. Specialization is dead because hulls are too expensive to be one-trick ponies. This convergence created the surface combatant category, rendering old labels obsolete. Let's look at the sensor suites, which are the true differentiator in modern warfare. A modern destroyer is defined less by its hull and more by its radar horizon and processing power. The U.S. Navy's AEGIS combat system turns a ship into an air traffic control tower for missiles. If a ship can command the airspace for 200 miles, it is a capital ship, regardless of whether you call it a frigate. The Europeans have developed air defense frigates like the Horizon class. These are frigates in name only. Their radar domes track hundreds of targets simultaneously. To a pilot locking onto them, the distinction between frigate and destroyer is irrelevant. The missile flying at Mach 3 doesn't care about the ship's classification code. However, there is one final frontier where the distinction still holds some water: endurance. A true destroyer or cruiser carries enough fuel and food to operate globally without a chaperone. A traditional frigate was tethered to a task force or a specific patch of ocean. But even this line is fading as nuclear power and efficient engines extend the leash. The absurdity peaked with the U.S. Navy's Zumwalt-class destroyer. At 16,000 tons, it is larger than many heavy cruisers of the past, yet it wears the DDG destroyer badge. Why? Because calling it a battleship or cruiser would have killed the program in Congress. The label destroyer was the only political container big enough to hold the budget. Thus, the modern naval fleet is a masquerade ball of mislabeled giants. To navigate this, we must stop looking at names and start looking at capabilities. If the distinction between frigate and destroyer is blurry, the line between corvette and frigate is non-existent. Historically, a corvette was a coastal patrol vessel, barely fit for open war. Today, the Russian Navy has turned the corvette into a strategic bomber. The Buyan M class is a tiny 900-ton riverboat, smaller than many private yachts. Yet, from the Caspian Sea, it fired caliber cruise missiles hitting targets in Syria, 1,500 kilometers away. This shattered the naval paradigm. You no longer need a massive hull to project massive power. If a mosquito can carry malaria, it doesn't matter that it's smaller than a lion. Israel's Sa'ar-6 class is labeled a corvette, but it carries 40 air defense missiles and 16 anti-ship missiles. That is more firepower per ton than almost any destroyer in the US Navy. So why call it a corvette? Because it operates near the shore and defends gas rigs. Mission dictates the name, but weapons dictate the threat. Do not confuse the two. The United States tried to reinvent this category with the Littoral Combat Ship, or LCS. They wanted a fast, modular corvette, but ended up with a fragile, undergunned speedboat. The LCS failure proved that speed is irrelevant if you cannot survive a hit or kill the enemy. Reacting to this failure, the US Navy pivoted back to the boring, reliable frigate. The new Constellation class is just a licensed Italian FRAMM design, admitted with humble pragmatism. It is a frigate because it is designed to be cheaper than a destroyer, not because it is weak. Meanwhile, China has resurrected the cruiser in all but name with the Type 055. The plan calls it a destroyer, but at 13,000 tons with 112 VLS cells, NATO classifies it as a Renhai-class cruiser. This brings us full circle to the sheer physics of magazine depth. In a saturation attack, he who runs out of missiles first dies. A frigate might carry 32 missiles, a destroyer carries 96, a cruiser carries 120 plus. That is the only math that matters in high-intensity peer conflict. But the final disruption is coming, and it will render all these biological terms obsolete. Unmanned surface vessels, USVs, are entering the fleet ghost ships with no crew, no galley, no beds. Without the life support tax, a tiny drone ship can carry the armament of a World War II frigate. What do you call a 50-foot autonomous boat that can sink an aircraft carrier? A corvette? A mine? A torpedo? The old language breaks down completely here. We are moving from a fleet of ships to a kill web. In this web, the frigate is just a sensor node, and the destroyer is just a floating magazine. The shooter might be a corvette, the spotter a drone, and the commander a satellite. The platform is irrelevant. The network is the weapon. So, when you look at those models and feel confused, know that the confusion is intentional. Frigate, destroyer, and cruiser are bureaucratic buckets for funding, not tactical truths. A frigate is a frigate because the admiral convinced the treasury it was affordable. A destroyer is a destroyer because the admiral convinced the Congress it was invincible. To understand modern naval warfare, ignore the classification painted on the hull. Look at the displacement, count the VLS cells, and check the radar range. Physics does not care about tradition, and a missile does not care about nomenclature. In the next war, a frigate might save the fleet, and a cruiser might be the first to sink. The ocean is a dark and unforgiving place that strips away these human vanities. It only asks one question: can you complete the kill chain before you are broken? If the answer is yes, you are a warship. If the answer is no, you are a target. The rest is just noise. Stop reading the labels. Start counting the tubes. This is the reality of the modern surface fleet. Brutal, expensive, and deceptively named. Welcome to the age of the nameless kill box.